Hello, I'm Sang-Hoon Lee from Gyeongsang National University in Korea. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful satellite meeting on community structures of network, which is definitely one of the most important topics of network science. And the main topic I'll talk about today is the community structures of bipartite network, but I'll start with a bit seemingly different issue of stochasticity of a community detection result, because this particular topic is in fact the serendipitous direction of the research during my journey to investigate the consistency or inconsistency of the community detection in collaboration with my great collaborators listed here. And of course, I really don't need to introduce the general overview and the importance of the community structures in network at this satellite meeting. For those of you not familiar with the topic, community structure of a network refers to this kind of a division of an entire network into pieces where each of them is statistically more densely connected inside than the interconnected connection. This is a fairly intuitive concept, but at the same time quite practical to see the structural and or functional subunits lurking in this kind of a network system. And this is a famous or infamous karate club network, an illustrative example with the communities as a result of the fight between the administrator and the instructor, which has become a sort of icon of this field. One of the most conventional ways to detect such a community structure is to maximize this objective function called modularity. Basically, it quantifies how many of the edges are intra-connected ones compared to the background or expected ones expressed by this null model term here for a given community partition. So the maximizing this function corresponds to finding the most densely intra-connected subpart. By the way, I always emphasize that the sort of control parameter here is the Kronecker delta here, in fact, embracing the community division, because this part here is in fact given for network structure. And how many of them are literally counted will count. A bit later technical but important part you should remember throughout my talk is this resolution parameter, gamma, in front of this null model term. And it basically controls the overall scales of the communities found, where the larger values of gamma yield smaller communities or larger number of communities equivalently, as illustrated here. And the problem of maximizing the modularity is of course computationally challenging because of the combinatorially exploding number of possible divisions here. And in fact, how to cleverly find an approximate solution is the key to this modularity-based technique. Luckily, there are lots of publicly available algorithms to detect the communities, so you can just choose one of them and apply it to your network of interest. So suppose you decide to detect the community structure of a given network, but you may immediately encounter this issue. So this kind of statement, detect the community structure, looks like a completely innocent order if you just study network community detection. But if you are a practitioner of community detection and try to find the communities with especially the stochastic algorithm, you will immediately encounter this situation. So you run the algorithm and get this very nice result. Well, that's it. This is the community structure, you may think, and start to write the paper. Unfortunately, if you run the code again and again, you will get these results. Therefore, you end up with this ensemble of community structure, not a single one. So the issue here is the inconsistency of the result. Is this necessarily a bad thing that should be fixed? Well, in fact, it turns out that we can use them to study structural properties of the network. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. First, we can construct this co-occurrence matrix for each node pair whose elements indicate the fraction of node pair belonging to the same community in the ensemble of community structures found. If a pair of nodes always belong to the same community or always belong to a different community, the matrix element will be 1 or 0, respectively. In this case, the intermediate values, something like 0.6 or 0.4 here, these kind of intermediate values indicate the inconsistency. So only these three nodes between the two obvious bulk of communities are responsible for the inconsistency. So based on the co-occurrence matrix here, we formulated the inconsistency called companionship inconsistency or COI of individual nodes by simply symmetrizing it and taking the average over all of the other nodes. So we can treat this COI value as a new node centrality to quantify the local measure of community inconsistency, which may eventually reveal functional flexibility of the node. So if you are familiar with the node centralities, you may ask, this kind of bridginess can be detected with the betweenness centrality as well. That's a very good question, but here's our counterexample. Because of the betweenness centrality only takes the shortest path between the node, it cannot detect this bridge part composed of these two consecutive nodes. So we believe that our measure, based on the co-occurrence matrix, represents the more genuine nodal community inconsistency. For the audience technical enough in this field, we use the version 2.1 of a Jen-Lubang algorithm for all of the results I'll present from now on, which is a variant of the famous Lubang algorithm, where the nodes are greedily merged to maximize the modularity. And due to the stochastic nature of merging, it is inherently stochastic. So as an appropriate example, we generated this clustered Erodoshi-Renyi random networks, where we loosely connect the pre-assigned communities composed of the dense random networks and put a number of inconsistent nodes here at the central part intentionally. So the pre-assigned community structure is colored according to their community structure on the left side. And the shade on the right side correspond to the COI value, meaning the inconsistency. So if you just try to detect the community structures here, the central part composed of those inconsistent nodes is labeled just randomly. But the inconsistency measure here effectively captures that the membership is in fact very inconsistent. So we cannot trust the labels, this part. And of course, we need to test our method dutifully on this sacred network, the Karate Club. So at this particular values of resolution parameter gamma, 0.7, we found this interesting node, very interesting node here, with absolutely larger value of a COI than any other node, meaning that the member here is the most neutral about this reported dispute inside. Especially because this node has only two neighbors, we call this node the outsiders. The second example is a slightly bigger one, the Star Wars character network. For those of you knowing the stuff, these are networks of characters appearing in the original trilogy of the movie Star Wars, and they are connected if they appear in the same scene. In this network, Luke Skywalker, the main protagonist of the entire series, naturally interact with various characters in different communities. And of course, he's far from being an outsider, and we call him a multiplayer characterized by a large degree and large COI value simultaneously. So in this paper published 3 years ago, we presented the main idea of using the local community inconsistency as a kind of a node centrality and its implication. And of course, the correlation between the inconsistency and other network centrality measure, which you can find in the paper. But we believe that there should be more systematic studies on this problem. First, we took the resolution parameter here rather arbitrarily, and we didn't have some kind of a global measure to quantify the overall network-wise inconsistency. So in the follow-up study, we came up with a global measure of inconsistency called partition inconsistency, or PI, based on the cutting-edge similarity measure for different community partition called element-centric similarity measure here, and the more sophisticated local measure of inconsistency called membership inconsistency, or MEI, both of which has this nice scaling property, namely the effective number of different configurations in the global level and independent membership in the local level. For details, please check our paper published last year. By far the most important aspect of this recent work is that we finally started to look at the whole spectrum of communities by adjusting the resolution parameter gamma. So by looking at the global measure of inconsistency, or pi, as the function of community resolution, we can pinpoint the range of gamma where the inconsistency becomes very small, like this. Or in other words, consistent or reliable communities are found, especially when the number of communities stay flat at a certain integer value, just like the shaded regions here. By using the series of model networks with the single level or double level hierarchical communities, we verified that our measure can find these most consistent communities across different community resolution. Here, the single level and the double levels here. And by taking various real-world networks again, we can actually pinpoint the regions of meaningful community structure. For all of the details, please check out our paper published last year. And there's another interesting way to utilize our measure, which is demonstrate the absence of community structure. So in a paper published 2 years ago, I showed the absence of local minimum or inconsistency and flat part of the number of communities as an evidence of the irrelevance of community structure for these mutualistic networks in ecosystem. So here, there is no flat part for the number of community and the local minimum of this pi value. And this particular data led me to think about quite a serendipitous direction of research, because the mutualistic network I mentioned in the previous slide is an example of a so-called bipartite network where there are two different types of nodes with the interactions only existing between the different types. In this case, the plants and the animals helping each other for pollination and seed dispersal. And because there is such a strict structural constraint, we have to kind of modify the null model term in the modularity function to properly detect the communities here. So here's the illustration of the problem. In bipartite network, because there cannot be any interactions between the nodes in the same type, essentially this rectangular matrix, not the square matrix, composed of the rows and columns for different types, include all of the necessary information. However, if you just use the conventional adjacency matrix used in the unipartite network, we'll get this empty square, which is a kind of waste of space. So the only essential part is this one and this one. So in this case, if we just use the conventional Newman-Gerben type of null model term, this supposedly empty part will also be filled proportional to the product of the degrees of the node. So in this paper published in 2007, the author pointed out this problem and suggested this quite natural way to modify the null model term by using this rectangular null model term by using the rectangular null model block here. If I illustrate this schematically like this, the Newman-Gerben null model include the possibility of connection between the nodes of the same type, like this, which is prohibited in a bipartite network. So we should use this proper null model, properly modified to deal with the bipartite network. But in fact, this paper didn't show the direct comparison between the result from this null model term and the conventional null model term. So after my paper on mutualistic network was published 2 years ago, I re-examined the data with this more proper null model term, and the results looks not that different, which is in part fortunate because that means that my conclusion of the absence of the community structure in this data still holds. But if you look closely, there are some difference here. So then I decided to compare the effect of this proper null model term for other bipartite networks. For example, the bipartite network of human diseases and their related genes, and clearly there's some difference, especially at this large gamma part, as in the mutualistic network. A more dramatic difference is shown for this bipartite network of a language and the countries speak that language. But unfortunately, I couldn't find the proper explanation for this difference. So, of course, I decided to apply this framework to model networks as benchmark. First, I generated this modular bipartite networks between the left part and the right part. And the vertical spacing here represent the different communities. The most upper and the most lower vertical levels represent the clear communities with the dense interconnection with the node in the same level. And I set the node in the middle as ambiguous members with the same probability of connecting to any level, where the nodes are bigger proportional to this membership inconsistency value. As you can see, the regimes with the stable or reliable community detection looks noticeably wider here compared to this Newman-governed null model part. And the same trend is observed for some different settings, such as a different number of communities and the different size of communities as well. So the advantage of using the proper bipartite null model could be this more reliable result here, much wider region compared to the result with the conventional Newman-governed null model without consideration of this proper bipartite network structure. Well, unfortunately, due to the time limit, I cannot explain all of the details about this part. So if you're interested, please read this paper. Probably this archive version would be more accessible to you. So here's a summary and future outlook on my work, which is bipartite networks community structure examined with the community inconsistency measure. And the most important lesson I've learned is to use the proper modification of the null model term, and that can also be applied to other types of networks with the particular restriction in their structure. So I believe that this modification of the null model term is also worth investigating much more deeply than just restricted to this bipartite or other some simple types of restriction in the network structure. Again, I would like to emphasize the utility of the inconsistency of the community detection result to obtain the meaningful structural properties of network communities in both local and global level. Again, if you're interested enough, then please check out a series of my paper. Especially the first two papers are about this inconsistency analysis, and the third paper is about the bipartite network analysis. Thank you for listening, and I welcome any question or comment.